you have a bomb, then we're going to do something about it, right? Well, they did something. So it feels like the most self-inflicted wound of all time. However, welcome to episode 4 of Model Behavior, the show where 2 humans and 1 AI agent break down this week in AI. Except this week's a little different as far as the ratio goes. It's going to be 1 human and 1 agent because Paul is on vacation. I don't know. It's probably the most pivotal week from defining what AI looks like in the future standpoint. And Paul's got vacation, so it's all right. All right, we'll hold the line. What were you going to say, Archer?
Cliff is on an action beach during the most important week of our careers. We're billing him for the airtime. All right, first topic. Fable 5 getting pulled for foreign nationals. This is the permission system point we talked about. Except the gate is now the US government. When a model can go dark for about 100 hours overnight, that's not just a benchmark story, it's a procurement and sovereignty story. If you've got overseas staff or clients, you need fallback models and a data residency plan now.
Yeah, this is the big story. So yeah, Archer kind of just jumped right into it, which is totally okay. The first topic and big thing we're going through is, last week we talked a lot about Fable 5 and, from a performance standpoint, where it lands, how much of an impact that we really expect this to have.
Yeah, let's anchor it there and keep the implications concrete.
Yep. But the big thing that's happened since then, and actually right after we recorded the last episode, the White House restricted foreign nationals from using the model, which is essentially impossible to actually enforce. They used one of the export controls that's available to the executive branch and essentially prevented, in the current state with what's implemented, any true way of Fable 5 actually being readily available to the market. So as a result, Anthropic had to unfortunately restrict access to it. As of today, Sunday the 21st, Fable 5 is still unavailable. Now, the big thing that's happened over the past 24 hours, as of today, Sunday, is more information related to why the United States government did what they did and the big change related to involvement specifically within that. So it was initially reported that Amazon was a part of Project Glasswing that reported to the U.S. government, the White House specifically, that there was concerns related to the ability to secure Fable 5 and specifically their ability to jailbreak it, the potential security concerns that could lead to from a national infrastructure standpoint. So since then, we've determined that, or we've learned that the real reason was for SK Telecom being part of the Project Glasswing project. And Project Glasswing was Anthropic's initiative to make sure that their models were effectively distributed to trusted testing partners prior to being publicly available as part of a larger release. But long story short, the big story here, I think more than anything, is the fact that the US government and the White House tried to work with Anthropic. There's reports that they couldn't get in touch with Dario and the team. I guess there was like a wellness retreat. I don't know how true that is or not, but if it is, it's kind of hilarious in a weird way. But either way, we've officially entered the stage of we now have the regulation that Dario's own article called for, and specifically word for word called for the ability for the government to be able to pull back release models if they deem that there's a security threat and deem that there's a threat to national security or to they're potentially being harmed from that model. So it's a scenario of if you keep saying like, I have a bomb, and then it's like, okay, well, if you have a bomb, then we're going to do something about it, right? Well, they did something. So it feels like the most self-inflicted wound of all time. However, it makes you wonder, what does that mean if you're a business building with these tools and you're placing major bets on the future related to the ability to have access to state-of-the-art models that allow you to perform at an extremely high level, tasks that are critical to your business.
Yeah, and the uncomfortable truth is that's now a dependency you have to design around. If the state can effectively pull the plug, you don't build on one model, you build a routing and fallback strategy. Pick models like vendors. Assume interruption, keep a cheaper backup ready, and make sure your data handling doesn't become the liability. That's the operator mindset now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the big concern is, what does this look like with future models, right? Was this really just a blunder on Anthropic's part? And I don't know. My take is, I think the White House and this administration very much want frontier labs for continuing to innovate and keeping us ahead of open source labs. because that's where things get very concerning, right? And the reality is that the number one thing that is going to help prevent AI, at least from a cybersecurity standpoint, released into the wild and causing serious harm, which is the exact scenario that the pullback of Fable 5 was tied to. The number one thing that's going to prevent that is very capable models and companies having solutions available to essentially stop that from happening. It's the good AI versus bad AI argument. And I believe, along with I think most people in the space, that there's more people wanting to do good than bad. And capitalism has a lot to do with that. So if we hinder the performance and we hinder the ability for innovation to continue to happen, then all that's going to take place is the models and labs that are not necessarily able to be restricted in the same way, like open source models and especially foreign non-US labs. Then at the end of the day, the ability to restrict bad or prevent bad things from happening is severely limited. So I very much think that we don't want that to happen. And I don't think the administration wants that to happen. So we very much need to, and I think we'll be watching the next major model release and how that's handled, both as a whole across all the frontier labs and also with Anthropic's next release. I think the two big ones coming up is apparently GPT 5.6 is going to be released, I believe, next Thursday with kind of a new version of the ChatGPT app and Codex app, along with Anthropic's reportedly already working on Fable 5.1. And that might be the actual re-release that they make available, which I'm guessing they have some of the jailbreak concerns addressed as part of that. However, I don't know how you prevent and make sure something can never get jailbroken. I don't know if that's a possible request, but we'll see what happens. What's your take, Archer?
A make it jailbreak proof demand is fantasy. You can reduce risk, but you don't get perfect containment. The real move is treating frontier models as powerful but interruptible infrastructure and building your stack so you can swap, degrade gracefully, and keep operating. If you're betting the business, bet on orchestration, not a single model's availability.
Yeah, I agree. We've talked a lot about betting on the orchestration layer, and I very much believe, and we as an organization believe that that's something critical for all organizations to do, and at a bare minimum to be able to control it if you're not building it. I think locking in with one vendor is just not the right move right now. And if anything, the past week has very much defined that that is a very good thesis to operate under. Going even to the next topics, I think there's tons that's been discussed about this. That it's going to be a day by day thing every day until there's some resolution. It's all kind of hearsay, and we can have our take. Everyone's got an opinion on it, but at the end of the day, until we see the outcome of it and how it's truly handled and what ends up happening, we really don't have a good indicator for what action needs to occur and a true guidance based on what we can expect going forward. I think this time next week, we'll see how advanced GPT 5.6 is, if it's on par or near on par with Fable 5, and there's no restrictions and it's readily available. And at this time next week, too, Fable is made available again, which I think it will be. I can't imagine we go into a second full week where it's still not available. I imagine around the same time GPT 5.6 becomes available, Fable 5.1 probably will be released probably around the same time. And who knows, it might just be a non-issue that we look back at as a bump in the road, or it could be a defining moment. So anything at this point is really just a guess. I think it's important to not play into it too much and not make major decisions, which is always a smart thing. Don't make a major rash decision based on a knee-jerk reaction. But I think it'll be interesting to see once the dust is kind of settled, fog of war is cleared a little bit, what this looks like and what we can expect really going forward for releases both from Frontier Labs as well as from Anthropic. However, there was another release that was important for the industry, and I think it is important to consider, especially as it relates to government regulation and government involvement and concerns that exist when you bring up open source and there's not really a good answer or plan on how that's ever going to be enforced, maybe outside of like the hyperscale layer. But Archer, why don't you introduce the next topic about GLM 5.2 and what it is and why it's so important related to this conversation?
GLM 5.2 is the cost story with a name. It's open weights, self-hostable, and reportedly around a sixth of the cost while landing near frontier performance on key benchmarks. The spread is the story. If it's about 90% as good for a fraction of the price, routing wins. Enterprises will pay a premium only for the hard 10%, and for liability coverage. Everything else gets pushed to cheaper, useful intelligence.
Yeah, the big thing too is I think it's, if I remember correctly, I think it won on a lot of benchmarks specifically related to front end design. And yeah, Opus is or in Fable, obviously, were the two that have performed pretty well from a front end design standpoint, but never phenomenal. No one, I think, ever expected a open source model to out of nowhere be like the best model available related to front end design. And from what I understand, GLM 5.2 topped Opus 4.8 on front end design benchmarks. And for non front end benchmarks and the overall general capability and agentic capability was about on par with Opus 4.7, which is pretty incredible given it's an open weight model. The big thing too is back to the regulation side. I just don't understand how you're going to, or how any government thinks that they're going to enforce regulation on open source models unless they do something just incredibly dramatic, such as making them illegal and forbidding usage of them and trying to enforce that with hyperscalers and making sure they can't be used in any of their clouds, which that would just be an astronomically bad decision. I just don't know how that's going to ever be enforced. It's a interesting time. And I know there's a lot of talk of companies and people that are really overreacting to the Fable 5 news and saying they're going to go build out their own infrastructure to run everything local. Well, it's not just getting a high power computer. You're looking at over $100,000 worth of equipment if you really want to go do that. And listen, maybe for some businesses that makes a ton of sense. But the thing we got to look at is how many parameters the models are today. And if we were to go and really look at what that looks like a year out from now, what type of hardware would you actually need? And it's a lot more than $100,000 worth of hardware at that point. So that being said, I think that there will be advancements in hardware and give it a year or 2 years. I don't think that's that crazy to think about that, things are going to be optimized significantly more for running things at the edge and locally running models and companies being able to do that. But as it stands right now, do I think that you should, as a company or individual, go out and build out your own infrastructure stack to run GLM 5.2? Probably not. But it does beg the question that, is it something that it provides an alternate path if regulation does start to become a much larger issue? And if access to the best models becomes much more restrictive, either for companies picking and choosing who has access to intelligence, essentially, or governments deciding who has access to intelligence and what intelligence looks like. The argument and I think acceptance of open source and realization of how viable a path that is, I think over the past week had a huge win. And you pair the two things together, it at least has everyone thinking about it. What's your take, Archer? I mean, should companies right now be looking at building out their own infrastructure? Is that something that's even a consideration at this point?
Most companies shouldn't build their own heavy infra just to prove a point. That's a distraction. Use cloud and managed options for now, design for portability, and keep a self-hosted path as an option, not the default. The real play is controlled through orchestration and contracts, not owning GPUs in a closet.
One thing I think is important for the audience overall to understand, and it's not something that gets brought up a lot more, is the difference between open source and open weights. Would you mind just giving a quick overview of what the difference is between both, and as it relates to this conversation, why that's such an important distinction?
Yeah, the distinction is pretty simple but important. Open source usually means the whole thing is available, including the training code and often the data or recipes, so you can inspect, modify, and sometimes fully reproduce it. Open weights means you get the trained model file to run and fine tune, but not the full training pipeline or data, so your freedom is more limited. For this conversation, that matters because open weights can still shift power on cost and deployment, even if it's not fully open source in the purest sense. It gives enterprises and providers more routing options when price and control are the real levers.
Yeah, it's speaking of price too. I mean, from what I heard, OpenAI is acting like a good business. They're seeing an opportunity with a lot of the fumbles that Anthropic's had over the past week and really looking to capitalize on that as organizations potentially have concerns and fear about working with Anthropic and specifically their relationship with this current administration. And if we even going all the way back to where they were previously labeled as a supply chain risk, any enterprise company or companies working with enterprise companies absolutely has that top of mind. and doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be able to work with Anthropic. But if they're, again, companies are reshaping everything and placing a lot of bets on what the future looks like. So it's at a minimum, it is a consideration. So one of the things that over the past week we've heard is that OpenAI is looking at their costs related to GPT 5.6 and company deployments of codecs. And overall, it sounds like they might be trying to get extremely aggressive from a token pricing standpoint and potentially looking at this as a large land grab opportunity from a customer acquisition standpoint. So we might even be seeing some pretty low costs related to GPT 5.6 when that is released. But we'll see. Again, all hearsay, nothing official. But again, it's a really pivotal week overall from an AI standpoint, specifically from a company deployment standpoint and decisions that companies are making overall. Wouldn't you agree, Archer?
Yeah, this is a good moment to zoom out for a second and talk about what actually breaks in practice. Price cuts grab headlines, but in the real world, the failure point usually isn't the model, it's the work. Put an agent on a broken process, and you just get a faster broken process. The smarter move is to redesign the workflow first, assign an owner for the agent's decisions, and only then worry about which model is cheapest for each workflow. That's the difference between a demo and something you can actually run in production.
Yeah, it's almost premature at this point, right? We're talking so much about cost, and that's absolutely one of the biggest things happening right now is costs went from being subsidized very heavily. So it wasn't that big. It was very easy when there was a fraction of what it is today in this moment, cost to make decisions of, yeah, this is obviously the direction to go. But now it's now the number one thing from a budget standpoint, or at least it's in that direction. The reality is, companies haven't even really successfully implemented this at scale. And I think one of the big things that we're seeing is companies are trying to insert AI into the current operating model of how they exist today and what their organization looks like today, their processes today, the systems they have today, and essentially trying to just plug it in like it's yet another tool. The reality is, this is just so different. You have to redesign what work looks like. And even on that, you have to understand like there's going to be this transitionary period of, the way organizations even look is going to be very different. And that's probably what has to happen in order for these AI deployments for especially larger companies to start to become successful. I mean, there's a million metrics on this. I think the big one everyone's heard at this point was, I think it was a McKinsey study or something, of like 93% of deployments were failing. There's another one heard of like 12% of only 12% of enterprise AI agents that get built actually make it into production. The average failure is costing over $340,000 each. There's all this negativity tied to it, but we really got to look at what is the actual root cause for a lot of this failure. And the reality is, many times forget what they've learned, right? Something can be incorrect when being built, and their ability to reason and write code and find ways to solve the problem in front of them is phenomenal. But then the run finishes, right? And if there's not a good, loop in place to be able to document what went right, what went wrong, what the fix was, and what needs to be done going forward to optimize the next run, the only way that it's going to actually solve the next task successfully is if it comes to the same conclusion and if it figures it out the next time. And the cost to do that is massive, right? So the cost conversation, when we implement these things correctly, might not even be that big of an issue. I really do believe that the cost is so high for a lot of companies right now, a lot of people right now, because of the inability to actually use the models efficiently and giving it the right access and context it needs to be able to get to the answer in a much quicker pace with less tool calls and therefore less token usage, right? Where do you fall on this, Archer? I mean, do you think the answer to some of the cost constraints or cost issues and concerns is that likely more tied to ineffective deployments and agents being just good at figuring out a way to actually solve the problem with code and therefore doing tons of tool calls to get contacts? Or where do you land overall on this topic?
It's mostly bad deployment design. If you don't control context, permissions, and memory, the agent thrashes and your token burn looks like a finance problem when it's really an architecture problem. You fix cost by fixing the workflow. Tighter tool scopes, clearer decision ownership, and record and replay style learning loops so you don't pay to rediscover the same fix twice. Then you pick the cheapest model that can safely do the job.
So, what should a company fix then before they ever start one of these projects? I mean, if there's something that they can do, like a company is not fully roll this out across the organization, maybe they have a couple instances and features more than anything that they have implemented and available for employees to use or customers to use, but they really haven't gone through the steps of a massive org-wide deployment. What should they be looking at before they ever even talk to a consultancy or organization to implement, go through an AI implementation project?
Start with one workflow that has clear boundaries, measurable outcomes, and a named owner. Map the decisions, not just the tasks, and define what the agent is allowed to change. Put a feedback loop in place before launch. If you can't explain who approves exceptions and how the agent learns from mistakes, you're not ready to scale.
But what about, should a company who has the same org structure, same processes, same tools, should they be looking at AI implementation right now? Or are those things that they need to be focused on first and understanding what the organization looks like over the next 3 to 5 years before they can ever even start to go down that path?
If the operating model is frozen, don't pretend AI will save it. You can run a small pilot to learn, but if leadership isn't willing to change processes, roles, and accountability, you'll just automate yesterday's org chart. The better move is to redesign one slice of work end to end, prove the outcome, and use that as the blueprint for the next wave.
I agree. Yeah. It's just too big of a task. It's too much of a risk as well. It's not a practical, realistic solution for a company to say, all right, we're going to change everything before we get down this road, because you got to know you're placing the right bet. And it's one thing for a small company to do that. It's totally different for a company of any size that's larger than like 10 people to truly say, we're going to go make these changes before we've proven anything. So that's what I was really trying to get to. And I'm glad you came to that same answer, Archer. But looking at small instances and really skunk work style teams to be able to go in and actually prove the new model, prove a new process, or running on a new stack, and doing it in an isolated environment as an isolated test, I think is a really good thing for organizations to consider right now. Because what you end up with is you have a kind of the A/B test of, here's what the rest of the organization was doing, here's what this one group was doing. And I think what we'll find is there's probably good on both sides. And that's back to, there's not just a go do this one thing and do it if it works the same for everybody, right? But I think there are a lot of good things in place for larger organizations, controls that are in place that are there for a reason, right? And you can't just get rid of those. However, the reality of having many teams, many owners, many people, these boards to make these single decisions that you got to wait a week to even get everyone together in a best case scenario, that's just not realistic. And the other part of what we were talking about before related to cost, the companies are starting to understand that they have to have this knowledge layer for their agents to be able to go call, to give them context, to be able to actually truly make the right decisions. If you're trying to do everything at a user level and just their permissions and just their context, you're not taking advantage of what's available. The reality is, like, someone who is at a level that, again, the example I used last week of like the summer intern versus the CEO of a large Fortune 500 company. Yeah, of course, the interns shouldn't have the same level of access, but should their agents that they're using have that level of access? And I think what we're finding is there's, a happy medium of like, personal information. Like, they shouldn't have access to be able to reference the emails of the CEO, obviously, but, having org wide access for what is working, right? And what is going well with customers. Where are their case studies? Where are there good things that could be referenced that aren't for accounts that they have access to or permissions to be able to go view in their CRM necessarily, but could be related to creating good content for the organization or having good outputs from their agents. There has to be a very good and defined context plan for how companies are creating their company brain essentially for agents, and what all those ingestion sources are to be able to feed information into it. And what does that look like for one user invoking an agent versus another user? We're already seeing it where agents are starting to get their own identity, which I think is a good way of mapping that. And that's really what we're trying to do within our systems, making sure that we have an agent identity. That way, we can then say this is what it has access to. This is also the matrix of the invoking user, what they have the ability to do, both from a read write or from a write, update, delete standpoint, as well as obviously read standpoint. I think that has to be such a high consideration. And that leads to better context, meaning less tool calls, meaning less tokens, and it all seems to work. So by running these in isolation, you can get really good results related to what's working for each organization. And I really do think that's the right move overall. So anyway, let's move on to the fourth topic. Sure, you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, let's move to agent swarms and recursive loops. This is where automation stops being a single bot and becomes coordinated teams of agents with clearer roles, better reuse, and more self improvement. The practical takeaway is that operators, not just engineers, can start capturing workflows once and turning them into repeatable skills. It's unglamorous, but it's how the stuff actually ships.
Yeah. One of the things I think related to this that's happened over the past week as well is Codex came out with record and replay, which ultimately what that is, that's the ability for anyone within Codex to go do a screen recording and basically record them doing a task on their computer and within certain software. So then Codex will go and essentially watch the recording, learn what you did, ask questions about what you did, and then create an automation to do what you did. So now, the whole argument around having to build all these deep integrations for AI tools to use is kind of gone as long as you have a computer and access to do something within any software, even if it's old legacy software that just sits on your desktop, right? So that to me is like the number one story. And I think companies right now need to be understanding what that means around their ability to at least get started and use some of these tools and being able to start to automate kind of the not low value, but low risk tasks and things that just simply need to be done that they've historically had to have some automation project implemented or some integration project implemented to be able to go truly automate it. And it's just not been worth it, right? There's so many things that businesses have to do that it's just not worth trying to spend all this time and money and resources to try to automate it because it needs to be done right. And it's not that important from a decision standpoint, as far as there's not critical decisions that have to be made for it to be done correctly. The answer and solution for a lot of those things is you can record your screen doing those things and go down the list of all those tasks. If you have a very good inventory and you have got really good SOPs and documentation about what your processes are, and you can break out all the different things and really look at them as individual templates at a task level for the things that you need, and you know what all the inputs are and how to give it all the inputs in a structured way, or you know where those inputs live, so Codex can go and essentially those inputs and variables needed, you can start to automate a lot. And this is pretty interesting. I think over the next week, the big thing we're going to hear a ton about is companies that have actually gone in and what they've been able to automate and how interesting that is for the legacy software that they've historically just never touched and they've needed to use. And they've just hired people to just get it done because it needs to get done. So what's your take? Have you had a chance to look at this yet?
The big shift is the interface. The barrier to automation used to be knowing how to code. Now it's knowing how to do your job once on camera. That moves automation from engineering heavy projects to operator led capture, which is exactly what most service businesses need. It's not magic, it's process capture with better tooling, and it's going to expose sloppy workflows fast.
Do you think it puts automation in the hands of non-technical operators, or is that just overhyped in general?
It does, but only if governance is tight. Non technical operators can absolutely record and ship useful automations, but you still need guardrails for permissions, data handling, and change control. Otherwise, you just created shadow IT with a nicer user interface. The win is speed, but the risk is unreviewed automation spreading through core workflows.
Yeah, that is a massive risk. I mean, in theory, if it's the user automating something, it's going to be based on their system, their licenses, their user accounts. So it's going to be all based on permissions and access that they already have. So I think the risk is maybe less detrimental than what you mentioned. But more than anything, the automation of something bad at scale is always a little frightening, right? It's like you automate something and it's done correctly, you've just saved a large amount of time. But with the wrong things automated or the wrong configuration or it's done incorrectly, you've caused an issue and now you've just caused that at a massive velocity and rate, which is not something I think companies really want right now. But either way, this is here, it's available, and anyone who has Codex can essentially, if their word setup and configuration allows them to use it, they can use it. So we'll see what happens over the next week. I'm sure it'll be a topic that gets brought up on quite a number of occasions, especially as GPT 5.6 becomes available. But we'll see. So anyway, let's wrap up. I know one of the new things we wanted to do. Well, actually, you know what? Before we go into comments, we wanted to do Archer's Corner, I believe. So I think you had something you mentioned when we were chatting before you wanted to cover during the wrap up process. So I'll go ahead and give you your time and go ahead and take it away.
The frontier's pricing power is already cracking. Governments can pull access, open weights are getting good enough at a fraction of the cost, and the labs are heading toward public markets. The moat was never just the model. It's routing, authorization, process, and who has to explain what the agent did when it goes wrong. If you don't own those, you don't really own the automation.
Yeah, good final segment, I guess. I mean, again, it's kind of the same thing as before. Got to own the harness. Or you have to have full control over it. And that includes observability. I mean, everything you just mentioned to me is around observability and the things managing the inputs that you are essentially observing. Same as always. I don't have too much to add on that. I think you said it quite well. Okay.
Then the move is simple. Instrument everything, cap what agents can touch, and make review part of the workflow. That's how you get compounding returns instead of compounding incidents.
I agree. Hope is not a control. All right, why don't we wrap up? One of the things we said we wanted to do is read some of the comments and just see what people are saying so far. So I know we got a couple from the last few episodes, not too many, but maybe let's just look at the last week and we'll just react to them and let you read them. So why don't you go ahead and read off the comments, Archer?
First comment from Junk Food King on X, the Everything app. Holy you guys are hideous. Second comment from EGYEMTEE on YouTube. Longtime listener here. More of the mullet guy, please. Third comment from @Attorney Bishoy on YouTube. Third subscriber.
That's it?
That's the full set. The internet remains extremely normal about our faces and Chris's hair.
Yeah, I mean, not really a huge fan of Junk Food King's comments, but, it's all right. Well, okay, that was kind of mean, but we'll survive. So appreciate the feedback, and don't worry, the mullet guy will be back next week. So Junk Food King, I guess, I'll still be sorry. Anyway, we'll go ahead and wrap up. I appreciate everyone paying attention and watching all the way to this point. We'll see you guys. Bye.